When a Hell's Angels boss dies, you would expect his children to inherit something. A name that opens doors, money, maybe even a place in the empire their father built. That is how it works in the great criminal dynasties, in the mafia and the cartels, where the throne passes down through blood. So you assume the children of a biker king inherit a kingdom, but they do not. And the truth is so far from that assumption that it can be summed up in a single sentence, spoken by a prosecutor in a Canadian courtroom, about one of the most feared outlaw bikers who ever lived. The prosecutor was talking about a Hell's Angels leader so powerful that an entire province lived in fear of him. And he said that the most heartless thing this man had ever done, out of a lifetime of murder and terror, was what he did to his own son. He said that this biker boss had ruined his son's life by making him one of them. Think about what that means. In this world, being the child of a boss is not an inheritance. It is a sentence. The father's legacy is not a gift handed down. It is, so often, the very thing that destroys the child who receives it. This is the story of what really happened to the children of Hell's Angels bosses. The sons who followed their fathers into the Brotherhood and paid for it with their freedom, and, in at least one case, their lives. The children caught in the crossfire of wars they never chose. The daughters shut out entirely. And the rare few who looked at the legacy waiting for them and did the hardest thing imaginable. They ran. Over the next hour, we are going to walk through all of it, the real families, the real names, the real outcomes. And by the end, you will understand something about this world that even most people who follow it have never grasped. Because to understand why a boss's child inherits a fork in the road instead of a fortune, you first have to understand a hard truth about this world. There is no throne to inherit in the first place. Start with the thing that makes the Hell's Angels completely different from every other kind of criminal organization, because it is the key to everything that happens to their children. The great crime families and the drug cartels are, at their core, family businesses. The enterprise and the bloodline are woven together. So when the man at the top falls, his children can step into what he built, because it was, in a real sense, a family possession. The son of a mafia boss can inherit his father's position. The child of a drug lord can inherit the network, the money, the power. The throne is a family heirloom and it passes down. The name on the empire is the family name, and the family name endures. The Hell's Angels do not work that way. They are not a family business. They are a brotherhood of patched men. And the single most important object in that entire world, the thing that carries all the status and all the power, the patch, cannot be owned by a family at all. It belongs to the club. When a member dies, his colors are expected to go back to the organization, because they were always the organization's to begin with. A chapter is not a dynasty handed from father to son. It is a collective of members, and its leadership passes to another patched man, chosen by the Brotherhood through its own internal process. There is no family throne, because the throne was never a family possession. It belonged to the club and it stays with the club. The name that mattered was never the father's surname. It was the name of the club, and no child can inherit that. So when a Hell's Angels boss dies, there is simply nothing for his children to inherit in the way a cartel heir inherits an empire. There is no network to take over because the network runs through the Brotherhood, not the bloodline. There is no patch to receive because the patch goes back to the club. There is no rank to assume because rank is earned through membership, and membership is something no one can inherit, no matter whose child they are. The boss's power, whatever it was, does not flow down to his children. It flows back into the organization that granted it to him in the first place. The kingdom, such as it was never his family's to give. It was only ever on loan from the club, and the moment he is gone, the loan is called in. And this is where the fate of a boss's child stops being about inheritance and starts being about something much darker. Because while these children inherit no empire, they are still born into the world their father made. And that world is not a world of thrones and fortunes. It is a world of violence, of prison, of enemies and sudden death, of a name that marks you before you have done anything at all. What a boss's child truly inherits is not power. It is proximity to danger. They grow up inside an organization that traffics in drugs and guns, that wages war with rival clubs, that kills to protect its secrets and sometimes kills its own members. They grow up as the children of marked men, with the shadow of the club's enemies and the shadow of the law falling over their homes. That is the real inheritance. Not a crown, but a life lived in the blast radius of their father's choices. Faced with that, a boss's child stands at a fork in the road, whether they understand it or not. And there are really only a few ways the road can go. The first path leads deeper in. Some children, and it is almost always the sons, are drawn into the same life their fathers lived, pulled toward the Brotherhood, absorbed into its orbit until they are living the outlaw life themselves. For these sons, the father's world becomes their world, and as we will see, that path leads with terrible frequency to a prison cell or a grave. The second path is the one the children never choose but cannot escape. To be crushed by the violence of the world they were born into, caught in the crossfire of a war that was never theirs. The third path belongs to the daughters, and it is a locked door, an exclusion so total that they cannot even follow their fathers in if they want to. And the fourth path, the rarest and the hardest, is escape. To look at the legacy waiting for you and reject it completely, to run from the name, to become someone else entirely in order to survive. Almost no one takes that final road, because almost no one has the chance or the will. But those who do reveal something important about all the others. Because here is the thing that ties all these paths together, and it is the dark heart of this entire subject. A boss's child does not get to choose the world they are born into. They inherit their father's name, their father's enemies, and their father's danger before they are old enough to understand any of it. And then, one way or another, that inheritance shapes everything that follows. For some, it becomes the road they walk to their own destruction. For others, it becomes the thing they spend their whole lives trying to outrun. But for almost all of them, it is a weight. The children of hell's angels' bosses did not inherit kingdoms. They inherited a question that would define their lives. What do you do when the most dangerous man you know is your father, and his world is the only one you were ever given? Before we can follow these children down their separate roads, we have to understand the ground they were all standing on. Because the world these children were born into was not an ordinary one, and the danger they inherited was not an abstraction. It was a documented, deadly reality, one of the most violent criminal environments on the planet. The Hells Angels began in 1948 in the town of Fontana, California, founded in part by returning veterans looking for the freedom and the brotherhood of the open road. From those small beginnings, the club grew into something its founders could never have imagined. It embraced a defiant identity as outlaws, and its winged skull emblem, the Death's Head, became one of the most recognized and feared symbols in the entire criminal underworld. But it did not stay small, and it did not stay in California. It spread, chapter by chapter, country by country, into a vast international network. Law enforcement in the United States has estimated that at its height the club counted somewhere around 2,500 members, spread across roughly 230 chapters, in more than 24 countries. This was not a local gang. It was a global brotherhood with a presence on multiple continents. And the Department of Justice and the FBI do not classify it as a social club. They classify it as an outlaw motorcycle gang, an organization tied to serious and ongoing criminal activity, including drug trafficking, gun running, extortion, and murder. This is the world these children were born into. Not a world of quiet respectability, but a world where their fathers were, in the eyes of the law, the leaders of a criminal enterprise. And the violence of that world was not theoretical. When these organizations went to war, the bloodshed was staggering. We will see, in detail, what one of those wars did, how it turned the streets of a modern city into a battlefield, how it killed scores of people, and how it even took the life of a child who had nothing to do with any of it. This was the environment. Bombs and bullets, drug empires and rival gangs, police crackdowns and prison sentences. To be born the child of a Hell's Angels boss was to be born into the center of all of it, into a family at the heart of a violent and hunted organization, with all the danger that came with that, and none of the safety that most children take for granted. And it is important to understand that this was not a phenomenon confined to one country or one city. Because the Hell's Angels spread across the globe, the story of the boss's child is not a single story but one that repeated itself, in its essential shape, across continents. In Canada, it produced the tragedy of the Boucher family. In the United States, it produced the tragedy of the Christie family. But wherever the Death's Head flew, wherever a chapter of the Hell's Angels put down roots, the same fundamental structure existed, and so the same fundamental fate awaited the children born into it. In Europe, in Australia, in South America, in every place the club established itself, there were leaders, and those leaders had children, and those children faced the same locked logic. No empire to inherit because the patch belonged to the club. No throne to take because rank was earned and never given. Only a name, a danger, and a fork in the road. The specific cases differ from country to country, the names change, the local wars and rivalries change, but the underlying truth does not. Everywhere the Hell's Angels exist, they exist as a brotherhood of patched men, and everywhere that brotherhood cannot be inherited by a bloodline. This global reach also meant that the danger these children lived inside was not unique to the Quebec War, terrible as that war was. Across the world, the Hell's Angels have been involved in violent conflicts with rival clubs, in wars over territory and drugs and honor, in feuds that turned deadly. In Scandinavia, an outlaw biker war between the Hell's Angels and a rival club grew so intense that the combatants used military weapons, including anti-tank rockets fired at clubhouses, a level of violence almost unimaginable in the ordinary world. In various countries, clashes between the Angels and their enemies have left members and bystanders dead, have brought down police crackdowns and mass trials, and have filled the lives of everyone connected to the club with danger and instability. So the world these children were born into was not just violent in one place at one time. It was a world defined by the potential for violence wherever it existed, a global brotherhood whose conflicts could turn lethal anywhere its colors were worn. And the children of the leaders of that brotherhood in every country grew up in the shadow of that potential, marked by their fathers' names, exposed to their fathers' enemies, and denied, everywhere, the one thing that might have made the danger worthwhile, a kingdom to inherit at the end of it. And it was a world with a code so strict that it shaped the children as much as the men. The Hell's Angels operate on an absolute law of silence, the rule that members do not talk to police, do not testify, and do not inform. That code did not stop at the men. It wrapped around their families too. The children of these bosses grew up learning from the youngest age that you do not talk about the club, that its business is secret, that loyalty and silence are everything. They were raised inside a wall of secrecy, taught to keep the family's world hidden from the outside. This is part of the inheritance too, a way of living defined by silence and suspicion, by the knowledge that the family was always, in some sense, at war with the world beyond its doors. So when we ask what happened to the children of Hell's Angels' bosses, we are not asking about the heirs of a business dynasty. We are asking about the children of the leaders of a global criminal organization, raised in a world of violence, secrecy, and danger, with no throne to inherit and every risk to endure. And the first and most common thing that happened to these children, the path that most of the sons walked, was to be drawn into that very world, the world that had made their fathers infamous, and to be consumed by it. No story shows the true cost of that path more clearly than the story of a son whose own father, according to the men who prosecuted him, deliberately pulled him into a life that would take everything from him. A father who was one of the most powerful bikers in the history of the Hell's Angels, and a son whose ruin became the ultimate proof of what this legacy really means. To understand what the legacy of a Hell's Angels boss truly does to a child, you have to meet the most powerful biker Canada ever produced, and the son whose life he destroyed. The father's name was Morris Boucher, though everyone knew him as Mom Boucher. And in the 1990s, he was the closest thing the outlaw motorcycle world had to a warlord. Boucher's own beginnings were grim. He was born in a small Quebec town in 1953 and raised in poverty in a tough, inner-city neighborhood of Montreal. He dropped out of school young and drifted into a life of crime, moving through the criminal underworld until he found his way into the outlaw biker scene. He joined the Hells Angels in Montreal in the late 1980s and rose through the ranks with startling speed, driven by ruthlessness and ambition. By the early 1990s, he was considered one of the most powerful bikers in the province, deeply involved in the lucrative and deadly business of cocaine trafficking. And then he reached for even more. As the leader of the elite Nomads chapter of the Quebec Hells Angels, Boucher launched a war for total control of the province's drug trade, a war so savage that it horrified an entire country. That conflict, which raged through the 1990s, became one of the bloodiest criminal wars in the history of the developed world. Over its course, it is estimated that around 160 people were killed. Bombings and shootings became a feature of daily life in Quebec. Boucher's Hells Angels fought rival organizations for every corner of the drug market, and the bodies piled up year after year. Boucher himself grew so bold and so contemptuous of the state that he did something almost unheard of. He ordered the murder of prison guards, officers of the justice system, chosen essentially at random. His goal was to terrorize and destabilize the very system that was trying to bring him down, to make the machinery of justice too afraid to function. 2 correctional officers were killed on his orders. He was eventually convicted of ordering those killings, after a dramatic legal saga involving an initial acquittal, an appeal, and a second trial that relied on an associate turned informant. He was sentenced to life, and he was sent to Canada's only supermax prison, where he would spend the rest of his days, surviving assassination attempts behind bars, before finally dying in 2022. He was, by any measure, one of the most dangerous and feared criminals in Canadian history, and he had a son named Francis. From a young age, Francis Boucher was pulled into his father's world. He did not stumble into it as an adult making his own free choices. He was drawn into the orbit of the Hells Angels while he was still a teenager, shaped by the gravity of the most powerful biker in the province, who happened to be his dad. Imagine growing up in that shadow, with a father who was building a criminal empire through violence, whose name was becoming synonymous with fear across the province. For a boy, that father was not a distant crime lord. He was simply Dad, the most powerful man in the room, the man whose world was the only world on offer. And that world drew Francis in. In that world, Francis found his place not at the top, where his father sat, but in the ranks of a group called the Rockers. And to understand what that meant for him, you have to understand what the Rockers were. In the structure of the Hells Angels, there are puppet clubs, subordinate gangs that work for the Angels and, crucially, do the dangerous and dirty work that the full patch members prefer to keep at arm's length. The Rockers were exactly this, a puppet club founded to serve the Montreal Hells Angels. And during the Quebec Biker War, it was the Rockers who were responsible for much of the actual violence, the foot soldiers who took the risks in the drug trade and in the fighting with rival gangs, while the elite members at the top stayed insulated from the immediate danger and the immediate legal exposure. This is where the son of the province's most powerful biker ended up, not protected at the top, but down in the ranks where the danger was greatest, where the risk of prison and death was highest. The most powerful biker in Quebec had a son, and that son was a foot soldier in a puppet gang. And the danger caught up with him, exactly as the structure was designed to ensure. When the massive police crackdown on the Quebec bikers finally came, a sweeping operation that targeted the Hells Angels and their affiliates, Francis Boucher was swept up in it along with the others. Evidence presented at the huge trials that followed showed that he had been a member of the Rockers, working for the Nomads chapter that his own father led. He was convicted of gangsterism, conspiracy to commit murder, and drug trafficking, and he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He was in his 20s, a young man whose entire criminal path had been laid out for him by the world his father built, now facing a decade behind bars for playing his assigned role in that world. And here is the detail that reveals the cruel logic of it all. Even though his father sat at the very top of the organization, that did not protect Francis. If anything, it placed him exactly where the risk was highest. Evidence from the trials painted a striking picture. It showed that Francis lived a life of some means, connected to the criminal enterprise, and yet his position in the structure meant he was exposed. Other members of the Rockers were even recorded grumbling about him, complaining that because his father was a Hell's Angel, Francis got to do what he wanted, that he was shirking some of his duties because of his family connection. But whatever small privileges his name brought him, they did not save him from the fundamental reality of his position. He was in the puppet club, where the risks were taken and the prices were paid. The structure of the club let the top Hells Angels stay insulated while the lower-ranking men, the puppet club members like Francis, absorbed the danger and the legal consequences. The boss's son was not spared because of who his father was. He was fed into the machine. It was during the trials that followed this crackdown that a prosecutor stood up and said the thing that cuts to the very heart of this entire subject. The prosecutor, laying out how the Hells Angels operated, how the leadership exploited the lower ranks and let them take all the risks, turned to the case of Maurice Boucher and his son. And he called it the most heartless example of all. He said that Mom Boucher, this feared and powerful man, had gotten his own son involved in this predicament. He stated plainly that Boucher had ruined the life of his son, Francis, by making him a biker in his gang, a decision that had landed the young man a 10-year sentence for conspiracy to commit murder, drug trafficking, and gangsterism. Sit with the weight of that accusation. Of all the terrible things Maurice Boucher did, a man who ordered the murders of prison guards and waged a war that killed scores of people. A prosecutor singled out the ruining of his own son as the most heartless. Not the murders, not the bombings, the destruction of his own child, because there is something uniquely dark about a father who takes his son, a boy who trusted him and looked up to him, and feeds him into a machine that the father knows will chew him up. Morris Boucher understood exactly how his world worked. He knew what happened to foot soldiers in the puppet clubs. He knew the risks they took and the prices they paid. And he brought his own son into it anyway. The father did not hand his son a kingdom. He handed him a prison sentence. He took a young man and fed him into the same violent machine that would eventually consume the father too. This is the truth about what a boss's legacy does to a child, laid bare in a single case. In the cartel world, a father who pulls his son into the business is at least handing him a share of an empire, however dangerous, a stake in a family fortune. But in the Hells Angels, there was no empire for Francis to inherit. There was only the role of a foot soldier, the risk without the reward, the danger of the outlaw life without the protection and the wealth that his father enjoyed at the top. Francis Boucher's inheritance was not power. It was a criminal record, a prison cell, and a life defined by the choices his father made for him before he was old enough to fully understand them. The name Boucher, which in the outlaw world carried enormous weight, which made grown men tremble, did not open a golden door for Francis. It closed the door of a jail cell behind him, and the story did not end when he walked out of that first sentence. The pattern that his father's world had set for him continued to shape his life for years afterward. He was paroled, but he remained entangled in a world of crime and a man who had been given a criminal identity in his youth and could not simply shed it like a coat. In the years that followed, he found himself back in the justice system on other matters. His life, a long series of collisions with the consequences of the world he had been raised in. At one point, he was even at the center of a bizarre incident in which he was mistakenly released from a Montreal jail after officials confused him with another inmate who happened to share his family name, an episode that authorities initially feared might have been a planned escape. This is what it looks like when a child inherits not a fortune but a way of life, a set of dangers and habits and enemies and entanglements that follow them long after the father is gone, long after the empire that never existed has faded into nothing. And it was not only his son that Morris Boucher's world reached out to touch. The shadow of his life fell across his family more broadly, in ways that show just how far the danger of a boss's legacy can spread. Even from behind the walls of the maximum security prison where he was serving his life sentences, Boucher's criminal reach was alleged to continue, and members of his own family were drawn into the fallout. When police announced a series of arrests connected to an alleged plot that Boucher was said to have directed from prison, aimed at killing a rival, his own daughter was among those caught up in the case, charged in connection with the conspiracy. Whether at the top of the organization or from inside a prison cell, the world Morris Boucher inhabited was one that pulled his children toward danger and criminal jeopardy again and again. His legacy was not something that protected and elevated his family. It was something that endangered them, that reached out from his own life and pulled his children into peril, generation after generation. So the story of Francis Boucher stands as the darkest possible answer to the question we started with. What happens to the children of Hell's Angels bosses? For Francis, the answer was a childhood spent in the orbit of a warlord, a young adulthood spent as a foot soldier in a brutal gang, a decade in prison, and a life defined by the criminal world his father had chosen for him. Not an inheritance, but a ruin. Not a gift, but a sentence. A prosecutor said it plainly that a father had ruined his son by making him one of them. And that single, devastating idea is the key to understanding almost every child in this story. The legacy of a Hell's Angels boss is a dangerous thing to inherit, and the sons who followed their fathers into the life paid the highest price of all. But Francis Boucher was not alone in walking that path. Across the border, in the United States, another son of another Hell's Angels leader followed his own father into the club. He too rose within the Brotherhood, earning a place in the world his father had helped build. And his story, though different from Francis Boucher's, ends in a way that is, in its own quiet way, just as tragic. Because for the sons who follow their fathers into this world, the danger does not always come from a courtroom or a rival gang. Sometimes the cost is simply a life cut short, and a family left to grieve a young man who walked the same road his father did. George Christie was, for decades, one of the most recognizable figures in the entire Hell's Angels organization. He served as the president of the Ventura, California chapter from 1978 all the way to 2011, making him the longest-serving chapter president in the club's history. He was a national spokesman for the Hell's Angels, an articulate and charismatic public face for an organization that usually preferred the shadows. One journalist described him as the most notorious Hell's Angel in America, second only to Sonny Barger himself. In his home territory of Ventura County, Christie was a local power, a man whose influence reached into the economic and even political life of the area. He was intelligent, one of the few outlaw bikers of his era with a college degree, and he built a life and a reputation at the very top of the outlaw world. His path into that world was, in his own telling, almost accidental. He grew up an only child of Greek immigrant parents, raised in a close-knit community, describing himself as a sensitive and timid boy. As a teenager, he became a surfer, and when one of his surfing friends showed up at the beach one day on a Harley-Davidson, something clicked. He bought his first motorcycle, against his father's wishes, and began drifting toward the outlaw biker scene. As he later put it, some people run away and join the circus. He ran away and joined the Hell's Angels. He became a full-patch member in the Lowe's Angels Charter in 1976, and just 6 months later he was made its president, a meteoric rise. 2 years after that, he founded the Ventura chapter and installed himself as its leader, a position he would hold for more than 3 decades. And like Morris Boucher, he had a son who followed him into it. His son, George Christie III, did not remain on the outside of his father's world. He was drawn into the same brotherhood his father led, and he rose within it. He became a member of the Ventura chapter, and eventually he was elevated to the position of vice president, the second in command of the very chapter his father had founded and run for decades. On the surface, this might look like inheritance, a son stepping into a leadership role in his father's organization, a prince taking his place beside the king. But it is crucial to understand what actually happened here, because it reveals the truth about how this world works and why it is so different from a mafia family or a cartel. George Christie III did not inherit his position. He could not have. In the Hell's Angels, rank is not handed down from father to son. There is no mechanism for it, no tradition of it, no possibility of it. A son who wants to be a member has to do exactly what every other man has to do. He has to hang around the club, become a prospect, a probationary member, and endure the long period of scrutiny in which every full member takes his measure. And at the end of it, he can only be accepted by a vote of the chapter, judged on his own conduct, his own loyalty, his own worth. His father's name and his father's standing may have opened a door for him, may have given him a place to begin, a reputation to build on. But he still for himself, and he still had to earn his rank as a member in his own right. The vice presidency was not a gift from his father. It was a position he obtained inside a brotherhood that does not recognize inheritance, a rank he earned in an organization where the only currency is what you yourself have proven. So the son of the Ventura president was not a prince inheriting a throne. He was a man who had walked the same difficult and dangerous road his father walked, into the same outlaw life, earning his own place through his own path. And that path, the path of the outlaw biker, carries a cost that has nothing to do with rank or respect. It is a life lived hard and lived close to the edge, a life of danger and pressure and constant risk. And in August of 2015, George Christie III died. He passed away unexpectedly in his sleep at just 39 years old. A young man in what should have been the prime of his life, gone without warning. The details of his death were not made public, and it would be wrong to speculate about the cause. But the fact of it stands as its own quiet tragedy. A son who had followed his father into the Hells Angels, who had risen to become the vice president of his father's chapter, dead at 39. Whatever the specific cause, here was a young life, shaped entirely by the outlaw world it was raised in, cut short far too soon. And there is a bitter irony in it that is impossible to ignore. The father had spent decades at the top of this violent world, had survived wars and prison and rivals and the constant threat of death, and lived into his 70s. The son, who followed him into that same world, did not reach 40. There is something almost unbearably poignant in that reversal. A father spends his life in a dangerous brotherhood, becomes a legend within it, endures everything it throws at him and survives. And his son, who admired him and followed him and earned his own place beside him, is gone at 39, and the father is left to grieve. This is the hidden cost of the path that sons walk into this world. It is not always a prison sentence, as it was for Francis Boucher. Sometimes it is simply a life lived so hard, so fast, so close to the edge, that it ends early, leaving a father to bury the son who wanted to be just like him. The legacy a boss passes to a son who follows him in is not power, and it is not safety. It is entry into a way of life that grinds people down, that fills their years with danger and their homes with fear, and that far too often takes them before their time. A son who follows his father into this brotherhood does not receive a soft landing or a protected life. He receives the same hard road his father walked, with all its risks, and no guarantee that he will survive it as long as his father did. And George Christie himself, in the years after he left the club, has spoken with painful honesty about what this life did to the people he loved. After more than 3 decades at the top of the Hells Angels, Christie's own story took a dark turn. In 2011, he retired from the club and walked away, and the response was immediate and total. He was excommunicated by the brotherhood he had served for so long, cast out, cut off, treated as an outsider by the men who had once called him brother. Sonny Barger himself was said to have placed Christie in a state of disgrace and banned all Hells Angels from having any social contact with him. 35 years of brotherhood erased. And on top of that, Christie went to prison, serving a sentence connected to a case involving the firebombing of rival tattoo shops in his territory, a charge he has always framed as a failure of leadership rather than a personal act of violence. Through all of it, Christie watched what his choices had done to his family. And in one interview, reflecting on the anger and the pain that his life had brought into his home, he listed them one by one. His wife was angry, his son was angry, his oldest daughter was angry, his middle child was angry, His youngest daughter was angry, an entire family filled with anger over the cost of the life he had chosen. This is the voice of a father looking back and seeing with terrible clarity what his world had done not just to him but to everyone connected to him. The legacy he built did not fill his family with pride and fortune. It filled them with anger and with grief. He gave his life to the Hell's Angels, and what it gave back to his family was a legacy of pain. Put the two families together, the Bouchers in Canada and the Christies in California, and a clear and painful pattern emerges. In both cases, a powerful Hell's Angels leader had a son who followed him into the outlaw world. In both cases, the son did not inherit an empire because there was no empire to inherit. Instead, each son walked the same dangerous road his father walked, and each paid a terrible price for it. For Francis Boucher, it was 10 years in prison and a life defined by crime. For George Christie III, it was a death at 39 after a life lived in the Brotherhood. Neither son received the golden inheritance that the children of cartel kings or mafia bosses might expect. Each received, instead, the danger of the outlaw life and the heavy consequences that come with it. The name that was supposed to be a blessing became, in both cases, a burden that helped lead a young man toward ruin. This is what happens to the sons who follow. They are drawn into their father's world. They earn their own place in it because inheritance is not possible, and then the world itself does to them what it does to everyone who lives in it. It endangers them, it consumes them, and it leaves the people who love them to pick up the pieces. Whether the end is a prison cell or an early grave, the lesson is the same. A Hell's Angels boss cannot hand his son a kingdom, but he can hand him a way of life. And that way of life is one of the most dangerous inheritances a child can receive. But the sons who chose to follow their fathers into the Brotherhood, whatever the cost, at least had some hand in their own fate. They walked the road, even if they were pushed toward it as boys. There is another group of children in this world, though, who never made any choice at all. Children who did nothing but be born to the wrong family in the wrong place at the wrong time. And for them, the violence of the biker world did not wait for them to grow up and decide anything. It reached out and touched them while they were still innocent, still children, caught in the crossfire of wars that had nothing to do with them. To understand the world that a Hell's Angels boss's children grew up inside, you have to understand what the biker war actually looked like on the ground. This was not a quiet, hidden conflict fought only in the shadows, a matter of the occasional body turning up in a remote place. It was open warfare, waged with guns and, terrifyingly, with bombs in the middle of a modern city. As the Hell's Angels and their rivals fought for control of the drug trade through the 1990s, bombings and shootings became a feature of daily life in Quebec. Cars were rigged with explosives and detonated on public streets. Rivals were gunned down in bars and on sidewalks. The streets of Montreal and towns across the province became a battlefield, a place where a hidden war between criminal organizations spilled constantly into the ordinary world where ordinary people lived. This was the environment that the children of these bikers were raised in. Not a world of quiet wealth behind high walls, but a world where the threat of a bomb or a bullet was a constant, ambient reality, where violence could erupt anywhere, at any time. And in the summer of 1995, that reality reached out and killed a child who had absolutely nothing to do with any of it. His name was Daniel Desrochers, and he was 11 years old. On a day in August of 1995, Daniel was near a parked vehicle in Montreal when a bomb, planted as part of the biker war, detonated. The explosion, meant to strike at a target in the underworld conflict, sent debris flying, and a piece of it struck Daniel. The 11-year-old boy, an innocent child who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong moment, was mortally wounded, and he died. He had no connection to the Hell's Angels, no connection to their rivals, no connection to the drug trade the men were killing each other over. He was simply a child, in a city where grown men were waging war with explosives. And that war took his life. The death of Daniel Desrochers changed everything in Quebec. Up to that point, the public had largely regarded the biker war as a private matter, a case of dangerous criminals killing other dangerous criminals, something to be deplored perhaps, but kept at a comfortable distance. The death of an innocent 11-year-old shattered that detachment completely. The province was horrified, gripped by grief and outrage. The idea that these gangs would wage war so recklessly, with such total disregard for human life, that a child could be blown apart in the crossfire while going about his day, ignited a public fury that would have lasting consequences. It galvanized demands for the government to act, to pass tough new anti-gang laws to break the power of organizations like the Hells Angels. The death of one child did more to turn public opinion against the bikers than years of gangland murders ever had. Daniel Desrochers became a symbol, a name that stood for all the innocent victims of a war fought by men who cared for nothing but power and money. Now, Daniel Desrochers was not the child of a Hells Angels boss. But his death tells you everything about the world that the boss's own children were growing up in. Think about it. This was the environment, a place where the men at the top waged wars so violent that children died in the streets. The sons and daughters of the Hells Angels leaders were being raised inside this exact reality, in homes connected to the very organizations planting those bombs and firing those guns. If an unconnected child like Daniel Desrochers could be killed simply by being near the wrong car at the wrong moment, imagine the danger that hung over the children who were actually inside this world, whose own fathers were the ones directing the violence and making the enemies. These children did not grow up in safety. They grew up in a war zone, as the children of the warlords who were fighting it. The bombs their fathers' organizations planted did not distinguish between targets and bystanders, and the children of the bosses lived every day in the knowledge, spoken or unspoken, that violence surrounded them. And that danger shaped their lives in ways that went far beyond the constant threat of physical harm. Consider what it meant to have a father like Maurice Boucher. His children grew up with a father who was one of the most hunted and hated men in the country, a man surrounded by enemies who might strike at any moment, a man whose very name was a target. And then that father was taken away entirely. Boucher was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, sent to a maximum security facility, isolated in a special unit because even in prison his infamy made him a target for assassination. There he would remain for the rest of his days, dying behind bars decades later. For his children, this meant growing up with a father who was first a warlord and then a prisoner, a man defined by violence and then locked away from them forever, present as a source of danger and then absent behind prison walls. This is another form of the inheritance these children received. Not a fortune, but a father consumed by his own world. The stability that most children take for granted, a father who comes home at night, a home that is safe, a name that does not mark you the moment it is spoken, all of it was denied to the children of these bosses. The instability ran through every part of their lives. Their homes could be raided by police at any time, doors kicked in, the family's world turned upside down. Their family names were known to law enforcement, flagged and watched, so that the children carried a mark wherever they went. The shadow of their father's enemies, Rival gangs who might seek revenge against the family of a leader fell over them constantly. To be the child of a Hell's Angels boss was to grow up knowing that danger could come from any direction, from the police who watched your family, from the rivals who hated your father, from the very violence that your father dealt in every day. It was a childhood of fear and uncertainty, lived in the knowledge that your family was at war and that you, as a member of it, were never entirely safe. This is the psychological inheritance of a boss's child. Not wealth and security, but anxiety and instability, the constant low hum of danger that comes from being born into a family at the center of a violent criminal world. And this reveals the cruelest truth of all about what these children inherited. In the great crime dynasties, the danger at least comes bundled with reward. The cartel heir who inherits the empire inherits enormous wealth and power along with the risk. The danger is the price of a kingdom, but the child of a Hell's Angels boss inherited the danger without the dynasty. They got the war without the kingdom. They grew up amid the violence, the raids, the enemies, and the imprisonment, but there was no empire waiting for them at the end of it, no throne to make the danger worthwhile, no fortune to inherit as compensation for a childhood of fear. They bore all the cost of their father's world and received none of the reward, because in this brotherhood there was no reward to pass down. Their inheritance was pure risk, stripped of any prize. The danger of the outlaw life, handed down to children who had done nothing to earn it and would receive nothing in return for enduring it. This is what it truly meant to be born into this world. Whether a child followed their father into the brotherhood and was consumed by it, like the sons we have seen, or simply grew up in the blast radius of their father's wars, the legacy was the same: danger, fear, instability, and the ever-present possibility of a violence that had already proven, in the death of a child like Daniel Disrochers, that it would spare no one, not even the innocent, not even a child. The children of Hell's Angels bosses did not inherit a life of privilege. They inherited a life lived under threat, shaped from birth by a world of guns and bombs and prison sentences, a world that gave them everything to fear and nothing to hold. And for one group of these children, the situation was even starker, because they were denied even the grim possibility that the sons had. The sons, for all the danger, could at least follow their fathers into the brotherhood if they chose. They had a road to walk, however dark, but the daughters of Hell's Angels bosses faced a door that was not merely difficult to open. It was locked, completely and permanently, by the most fundamental rule of the entire organization. We have seen that a son of a Hell's Angels boss might follow his father into the brotherhood and earn his own place, however costly that place turned out to be. Francis Boucher did it and went to prison. George Christie III did it and rose to vice president before dying young. The path was dark, but it existed. For a daughter, though, there is no such path at all, because the Hell's Angels do not admit women as members. Not as full members, not as junior members, not as members of any kind. It is one of the most fundamental and absolute rules of the entire organization. The club is, by its own ironclad definition, a brotherhood of men. This was not always the case, and the story of how it came to be tells you everything about the world these daughters were born into. In the earliest years of the Hell's Angels, there were female members. Women wore the patch just as the men did. But in 1964, Sonny Barger, the man who built the modern Hell's Angels, imposed a rule that changed the organization forever. From that point on, the club would be male only. And the reason he gave for it reveals the brutal logic at the heart of this world. He justified barring women, by his own account, on the grounds that female members were less able to defend their patches against rival bikers who might try to take them by force. In other words, women were excluded from the patch itself because, in his eyes, they could not protect it through violence. The single decision that bars a woman from ever holding power in this world was made for the sake of the patch, and the physical force required to defend it. And that decision, made decades ago, sealed the fate of every daughter who would ever be born into a Hell's Angels family after it. So a daughter of a Hell's Angels boss faces the same locked door her mother faced. She can never be a member. She can never hold the patch. She can never inherit anything resembling her father's position because the one path that exists in this world, membership in the Brotherhood, is closed to her by her gender before she is even born. Think about what that means. A son, at least, has a choice, however dark, however dangerous. He can follow his father in and try to earn a place. A daughter has no such choice. The door that might have led a son toward his father's world is simply not there for her. She grows up inside this world, shaped by it, marked by her father's name, exposed to all its dangers, the raids and the enemies and the violence. And yet the single avenue that might have offered a son some kind of place is completely unavailable to her. She bears all the cost of being a boss's child, and she is denied even the grim inheritance of the brotherhood that a son might claim. And so, for a daughter, the world offers only a few narrow roles, none of which involve power in her own right. She can remain within the world of the club as what is known as an old lady, the wife or girlfriend of a member, a role defined by loyalty, service, and above all silence, a role in which she is considered, in the blunt language of the culture itself, the property of a man. This is the position her mother very likely held. In this world, a woman is not a partner in the Brotherhood. She is attached to it through a man, granted a place on loan because of who she is with, a place that can be taken away the moment that man is gone or falls from favor. So a daughter who stays in this world often does so by stepping into the same subordinate role her mother occupied, becoming the old lady of some other member, one more woman standing just outside a brotherhood that will never fully claim her. The exclusion that defined her mother's life is passed down to her, one more generation of a woman denied any real power in the only world she has ever known. Or she can leave. She can try to walk away from a world that offered her nothing but danger and subordination, to build a life somewhere beyond the reach of the club. But leaving carries its own heavy cost, because the code of silence that binds this world does not release a person simply because they walk out the door. Even a woman who leaves is expected to keep the secrets she grew up with, to carry the family's hidden world with her, silent, for the rest of her life. So a daughter who escapes does not escape cleanly. She carries the weight of where she came from, the name, the secrets, the memories of a childhood spent inside a violent brotherhood, even as she tries to build something new. The point is that for the daughters of Hell's Angels bosses, the inheritance is exclusion layered on top of danger. They receive all the risk of being a boss's child, the marked name, the hunted family, the violence, and none of the possibility, however dark, that a son receives. A son can inherit his father's way of life, even if it destroys him. A daughter cannot even inherit that. She is shut out of the brotherhood by a rule made before she was born, left to occupy the same narrow, subordinate space her mother did, or to run and carry the secrets forever. In a world that already gives its children nothing but danger to inherit, the daughters are given even less, because the one path that exists is barred to them by their gender. Theirs is perhaps the loneliest position of all in this entire story, born into the shadow of a brotherhood, shaped by all its dangers, and denied any place within it beyond the role of property. So we have seen the sons who followed and were consumed, the children caught in the crossfire, and the daughters shut out by an unbreakable rule. For almost all of these children, the story is one of a legacy that damaged them, a name that marked them, a world that endangered them and gave them nothing to hold. But there is one more path, the rarest and the hardest of all, and it belongs to a very small number of children who did something almost no one in their position ever manages. They looked at the dark inheritance waiting for them, the name, the world, the legacy that had consumed so many others, and they rejected it completely. They ran. And to understand what that took, we have to look at the most extraordinary examples the criminal world has ever produced. If you are finding this story as powerful as I do, take a moment to subscribe, because this next part, the story of the children who escaped, is the most remarkable of all. It reveals just how heavy this inheritance really is, and what it costs a person to finally set it down. Now, let me show you what it takes to run from a name like that. To see what escape truly looks like, we have to leave the biker world for a moment and look at the child of an even more infamous criminal, because his story is the clearest example ever recorded of a boss's child rejecting a dark inheritance. His father was Pablo Escobar, the Colombian cocaine kingpin, one of the richest and most violent criminals in the history of the world, a man responsible for the deaths of thousands. And his son was born Juan Pablo Escobar. If ever a child was positioned to inherit a criminal empire, it was this boy. He grew up in almost unimaginable wealth, on his father's sprawling estate with its private zoo and its fleets of vehicles, surrounded by servants and luxury, the heir apparent to one of the largest drug fortunes ever assembled. When his father was killed in 1993 in a shootout with authorities, the world expected the son to take up the reins to become, as he himself later put it, Pablo Escobar II. That is what the logic of a criminal dynasty demanded. The empire needed an heir, and here he was. He did the opposite. In the immediate aftermath of his father's death, the young man was consumed by rage, and in a moment of grief and fury, he vowed revenge against the people responsible for his father's death. It was the reaction anyone might expect, the son of a warlord swearing to continue the war. But then he did something almost no one in his position has ever done. He stopped. He reflected on where that path of revenge and violence would actually lead, and he realized that it led only to more death, and eventually to his own. And he rejected it entirely. He chose instead to renounce his father's legacy completely, to break the cycle rather than continue it. His family fled Colombia, first to another country, then eventually settling in exile in Argentina, where they would remain, building new lives far from the world that had made their name infamous. And there, the son of Pablo Escobar did something remarkable. He changed his name. Juan Pablo Escobar became Sebastián Mariquin, a new identity chosen partly out of raw necessity, because the Escobar name was so toxic that, as he tells it, airlines would not even sell him a ticket under it, and partly as a deliberate act of severing himself from his father's world. He was not just hiding. He was becoming a different person, choosing a new name so that he could build a life that was his own and not his father's. He was rejecting not just the empire but the identity, the very thing that connected him to the man who had terrorized a nation. And what he chose to become is the most meaningful detail of all. Sebastián Mariquin studied to be an architect. Think about the symbolism of that choice. His father had spent his life destroying, blowing up buildings with car bombs, tearing apart the physical and social fabric of his country, leaving rubble and death in his wake. And the son chose a profession dedicated to building, to putting up structures rather than knocking them down, as if to answer his father's destruction with creation. He has spoken about this directly. about how becoming an architect was, in some heartfelt way, a response to all the buildings his father had destroyed, a chance to build something up instead of tearing it down. He built a quiet life in Buenos Aires, working as an architect, married, with a family of his own, a life about as far from a drug empire as it is possible to imagine. But he did not simply disappear into that new life, and this is where his story becomes truly extraordinary. He did something that required even more courage than changing his name. He turned around and faced his father's crimes directly, publicly, and repeatedly. He wrote a book about his father, an unflinching account of the man behind the legend that became an international bestseller. He appeared in a documentary in which he did the almost unthinkable. He sought out the children of his father's victims, the sons of men that Pablo Escobar had ordered assassinated, and he apologized to them, face to face. He met with the son of a justice minister his father had murdered, a man who had been just a boy when he watched his father's bullet-riddled body pulled from a car. He met with the sons of a presidential candidate his father had ordered killed, and he asked their forgiveness for his father's sins. In one case, the son of a victim and the son of the killer ended up embracing, a moment of reconciliation almost impossible to comprehend given the blood between their families. He explained his reasoning in a way that reveals the entire weight of what he was carrying. He said that he felt he had a moral responsibility to go before society, to recognize his father's crimes, and to apologize to the victims of those crimes. He did not commit those crimes. He was a child when his father ran the cartel, sheltered from the true nature of what his father did, and it was only as an adult, after his father's death, that he came to understand the full horror of it. And yet he took the responsibility onto himself, choosing to spend his life not enjoying his father's fortune, but atoning for his father's sins. He now travels and speaks out against the drug trade, against the violence his father embodied, and against the glorification of narcos in popular culture. He has become a vocal critic of the way television and film turn men like his father into heroes, warning that young people write to him saying they want to become drug dealers, that they see his father's life as something to aspire to, and telling them plainly that the path his father walked leads only to ruin and death. He rejected the inheritance, the money, the name, the empire, all of it, and chose instead a life of reconciliation and peace. It is perhaps the most complete example ever recorded of a boss's child looking at a dark legacy and refusing to accept it. It is worth staying with his story a little longer, because the details of what he endured and what he chose reveal just how hard that road truly is. Escaping a name like Escobar was not a single decision but a long and painful process. When he arrived in Argentina and set out to build his new life as an architect, the past kept catching up with him. He studied hard, he earned his degree, he began to find work. But again and again, when clients discovered his true identity, when they learned that this quiet architect was the son of the most infamous drug lord in the world, the work would dry up. The name was a curse that followed him even after he had changed it, a shadow that fell over every attempt to build something honest. And it got worse than lost business. At one point, he and his mother were imprisoned in Argentina on money laundering charges, accused because of who they were rather than because of anything they had done. He has described how an accountant discovered the family's identity and tried to extort them, and how, when they went to the authorities for help, they were the ones put behind bars, because it looked better to jail the Escobars than to protect them. It took a legal battle lasting some 7 years before the charges were finally dropped, and the family was cleared by Argentina's highest court. This is what the name cost him, even as he tried to leave it behind. The son of Pablo Escobar could not simply walk away. He had to fight, for years, to be allowed to exist as an ordinary man. And it was out of that struggle that he made his most extraordinary choice. Rather than hiding from his past, he decided to face it in the most public and painful way possible. The reconciliations he sought out were not symbolic gestures. They were genuine, agonizing encounters with the people his father had wounded most deeply. He reached out to the son of a Colombian justice minister who had been one of his father's fiercest critics, a man Pablo Escobar had ordered assassinated. That son had been just a small boy when it happened, a child who helped carry his father's bullet-riddled body. And decades later, the son of the killer wrote to the son of the victim, asking to meet, asking for forgiveness. The two men met, and against all odds, they ended up embracing. He also met with the sons of a beloved presidential candidate his father had murdered, men whose entire lives had been shaped by the loss of a father to Escobar's violence. To sit across from the children of your father's victims, to look them in the eye and apologize for crimes you did not commit but whose weight you carry, is an act of moral courage that is almost impossible to fathom. And he did it not once but repeatedly, building a life around the work of atonement. He has been just as fierce in confronting the way the world remembers his father. As television shows and films have turned Pablo Escobar into a kind of folk hero, a charismatic anti-hero whose story is told as thrilling entertainment, Marroquin has spoken out against it with real anger. He has warned that this glorification has consequences, that young people from around the world write to him saying they want to become drug traffickers, that they see his father's life as something to aspire to, a path to wealth and power and fame. And he tells them the truth, that the path his father walked leads not to glory but to ruin, to prison, to violence, and to an early and violent death, and that it destroys not just the man who walks it but everyone around him, especially his own family. When violence connected to the drug world touched even the production of a show about narcos, he remarked that nothing had really changed except the names, a grim reminder that the reality behind the glamorous fiction is still bloody and still real. His mother, too, eventually broke the silence, changing her own name and years later writing a memoir about her life and imprisonment alongside Pablo Escobar. The whole family, in the end, chose to tell the truth about the man rather than to profit quietly from his legend, and to use their story as a warning rather than a boast. That is the full measure of what it takes to escape a legacy like this. Not just to change a name, but to fight for years to be allowed a normal life, to face the victims of your father's crimes and beg their forgiveness, and to spend your days warning others away from the very path your father walked. It is a life defined not by inheritance but by atonement, not by taking up the father's crown, but by trying to undo the father's damage. And the fact that it can be done, that a person can carry a name that heavy and still choose to become something good, is perhaps the most hopeful thing in this entire dark story. And Sebastián Marroquin is not entirely alone in walking that road. Even within the drug world, there are other children who chose escape over inheritance. Consider the sons of Griselda Blanco, the Colombian trafficker known as the godmother of cocaine, one of the most ruthless figures in the history of the drug trade. She had tried to build her criminal operation into a true family dynasty, pulling her sons into her world, grooming them as heirs to her empire. And that world destroyed them. 3 of her 4 sons ended up dead, killed in the violence that surrounded the family's criminal life. Only her youngest survived, and after his mother's own violent death, gunned down in the street years later, he made a deliberate choice to walk away from the family business entirely. He has spoken about having to become a different person in order to break the tie to that world, so that his own children would not have to live the life that he had lived. It is the same choice Sebastian Mariquin made, the choice to sever the connection, to reject the inheritance, to become someone new so that the cycle would finally stop with him rather than passing to the next generation. These stories of the children who ran illuminate something crucial about all the others, including the children of the Hell's Angels bosses. They show that escape is possible, but that it is extraordinarily hard, requiring a person to reject their own name, their own family, their own history, and to build an entirely new self out of the ruins. Sebastian Mariquin had to stop being an Escobar in order to survive as a person. Griselda Blanco's surviving son had to become someone else entirely to break the cycle. That is the scale of what it takes to escape a legacy like this. It is not a matter of simply moving away or getting a job. It is a fundamental remaking of the self, a rejection of everything that connects you to your father's world. And it throws the fate of the sons who did not escape into sharp relief. Francis Boucher did not get the chance, or perhaps the will, to become someone else. He was pulled into his father's world as a boy, given a criminal identity before he was old enough to choose, and consumed by it. George Christie III followed his father in and died within that world at 39. They did not run. Most of the children in this story did not run, could not run, were never given the chance to imagine a different life. The difference between the children who are destroyed by these legacies and the rare few who escape them comes down to that single, agonizing choice, and to the chance to make it, to accept the inheritance, or to reject the name entirely and become someone new. Almost no one manages the second, but those who do prove that a dark legacy, however heavy, does not have to be a life sentence. It can be set down. It just takes more courage than most people will ever be asked to summon. Now, all of this raises an obvious question. If the children of Hell's Angels bosses inherit only danger and no kingdom, is that simply how the criminal world works everywhere? Do the children of all crime bosses face the same empty inheritance, the same absence of a throne to sit on? And the answer is no. And understanding why not is the final piece that makes the fate of the biker children so distinct and so bleak. Because in other criminal worlds, the children genuinely do inherit the throne. In the mafia and in the cartels, the crown passes down through blood, exactly as our instincts told us it should. It is only in the world of the Hell's Angels that this ancient logic of inheritance breaks down. Look at the mafia, and the contrast could not be starker. The old crime families are dynasties in the truest and most literal sense. They are organized around blood, around family, around the passing of power and name from one generation to the next. Leadership is not always inherited automatically, but the son of a boss occupies a special place. And again, through the history of organized crime, the children of bosses have stepped into their father's positions of power. Consider what happened when police in one major North American city announced a sweeping crackdown on the leadership of the local mafia. The men they identified as the new leaders of the organization were, strikingly, the sons of the previous generation of bosses. One of them was the son of a legendary mafia godfather, a man who had grown up, remarkably, to become a lawyer, a respectable professional, and who had then stepped into a leadership role in the very criminal organization his father had once ruled. Another was the son of another top figure in the same family. These were not men who had to start at the bottom and claw their way up through years of scrutiny and proof. They were sons who moved into leadership, at least in part, because of who their fathers were, inheriting position and influence in an organization built around bloodlines. This is how a criminal dynasty works. The throne is a family possession, and it passes from father to child. The son of a boss can become a boss, precisely because the enterprise and the bloodline are one and the same thing. The family name is the brand of the empire, and the empire belongs to the family. When the father falls, the son can rise, because the whole structure is designed around the continuity of blood. The same is true in the great cartels, where the business is a family business, where wives and sons and brothers and cousins are woven directly into the operation, and where, when the man at the top is captured or killed, the family network, including his children, can keep the machine running or step forward to lead it. In these worlds, a boss's child inherits something real, however dangerous, however cursed. They inherit the empire, the network, the position, the crown. Perhaps the most famous example of this in American history is the Gotti family of New York. John Gotti was the boss of the Gambino crime family, one of the most powerful mafia organizations in the country, and one of the most notorious gangsters of his era. A man so skilled at evading conviction that the press nicknamed him the Teflon Don, because the charges never seemed to stick, until at last they did and he was sent to prison, where he died. And when the father went away, the son stepped up. John Gotti's son, John the Younger, had been formally inducted into the Gambino family, made a member of the very organization his father led. And after his father's imprisonment, the son reputedly rose to become the acting boss of the family, stepping into the leadership of the criminal empire his father had built. Think about what a stark contrast that is to everything we have seen in the biker world. Here was a son who did not have to start at the bottom and earn a patch through years of scrutiny. He was brought into the family, elevated within it, and positioned to lead it precisely because he was his father's son. The Gambino family was, in the truest sense, a family, and the leadership of it could pass, at least for a time, from father to child. That is dynastic succession, the inheritance of a criminal throne through blood, and it is exactly the thing the Hell's Angels make impossible. And the Gotti name carried on in other ways too, showing how deeply a mafia identity is bound up with the family itself. The daughter of the family became a well-known public figure in her own right, an author and a television personality. Her life and her children, the subject of a popular reality show built entirely around the Gotti name and the Gotti legacy. The point is that, in the mafia world, the family name is not just a burden to be carried or a secret to be hidden. It is an inheritance, an identity, a brand that the children carry forward for better or worse. The name means something and it belongs to the family and it passes down. The son can inherit the throne, and the family can build an entire public identity around the legacy of the man at the top. This is the essence of a criminal dynasty, and it is the world the children of mafia bosses are born into. Whatever else it costs them, and it costs them a great deal, they inherit something. A name that is theirs, a position that can be theirs, an empire that was built by the family and belongs to the family. The Hell's Angels are the opposite of this in every way that matters. And here we return to the truth that has run through this entire story, the single fact that explains the fate of every child in it. There is no throne to pass down, because the patch belongs to the club, not the family. A son cannot inherit his father's rank, no matter how powerful his father was, because rank in this world is not a family possession. It is earned through membership, and membership cannot be inherited by anyone. We saw it with George Christie III, who did not inherit the vice presidency, but had to earn his own patch through the same brutal, years-long process as every other man who ever joined. We saw it with Francis Boucher, who inherited not his father's throne at the top but a foot soldier's role at the bottom in a puppet club, where the danger was greatest and the protection was least. In the Mafia, the boss's son can become the boss. In the Hell's Angels, the boss's son can, at the very most, become a member in his own right, starting from nothing, earning everything, and inheriting none of his father's position or power. The bloodline means nothing to the Patch. The son of the most powerful Hell's Angel alive begins, in the eyes of the club, exactly where every other prospect begins, with nothing but the chance to prove himself. And so the children of biker bosses are denied even the dark inheritance that mafia and cartel children receive. They get the danger of the criminal world without the succession, the risk without the crown, the war without the kingdom. A cartel heir at least inherits an empire along with the danger. A biker boss's child inherits only the danger because there is no empire, no throne, no position that can pass down through blood. This is the final, defining difference. In every other great criminal world, the children can inherit power. In the world of the Hell's Angels, they cannot, because the source of all power, the Patch, can never belong to a family. It belongs to the Brotherhood, and the Brotherhood does not share its power with bloodlines. So we arrive, finally, at the full and complete answer to the question we began with. What happened to the children of Hell's Angels bosses? They did not inherit empires because there were no empires to inherit. The Patch belonged to the club and went back to the club when a member died. The rank was earned, never given, judged by a vote of the chapter and never by the accident of birth. The throne, unlike in the mafia or the cartels, was never a family possession to pass down. What these children inherited instead was their father's name, their father's enemies, and their father's danger, a legacy of pure risk stripped of any reward. For the sons who followed their fathers into the Brotherhood, that legacy meant walking the same dangerous road and paying for it in full. Francis Boucher paid with 10 years of his life and a criminal identity that was forced on him as a boy, a son whom a prosecutor said his own father had deliberately ruined by making him a biker. George Christie III paid with his life itself, dead at 39 after following his father into the club and rising to its second highest local rank. For the children caught in the wars, the legacy meant growing up in a world where bombs killed 11-year-olds in the street, where a father could be a warlord 1 year and a prisoner for life the next, where danger came from every direction and safety was something other children had. And for the daughters, the legacy meant a locked door, the same total exclusion their mothers knew, an inheritance of danger with not even the grim possibility of joining that a son might claim. To see the whole of it, hold two sons side by side. On one side, Francis Boucher, the child of a warlord pulled into his father's world as a boy, handed a foot soldier's role in a puppet gang, sent to prison for a decade, his life ruined, in a prosecutor's own words, by the father who was supposed to protect him. He inherited his father's world completely, and it destroyed him, exactly as it had destroyed so many before him. On the other side, Sebastian Mariquin, the child of an even more monstrous criminal who looked at the same kind of inheritance, an empire built on blood, a name soaked in violence, and rejected every part of it. He changed his name, built an honest life, and spent his years apologizing to his father's victims and warning the world away from the path his father walked. Two sons of two criminal kings and two opposite fates. One who accepted the inheritance and was consumed, and one who refused it and was, in the end, free. Between those two poles lies the entire truth of what it means to be the child of a boss. The inheritance is real, the danger is real, the pull toward the father's world is real and powerful. But so, for the rarest and bravest few, is the possibility of walking away. The difference between them is not the size of the fortune, Because in the biker world there is no fortune. The difference is the choice, and whether a child is ever given the chance to make it. And yet, threaded through all of this darkness, there is one thing that these children did inherit, and it is the only inheritance this world truly allows. Not power, not a patch, not a throne, but a name and with it a choice. The choice of what to do with the legacy they were handed. This is the one thing the club cannot take back and cannot control. When a Hell's Angel dies, his colors go back to the club, his rank passes to another man, and his place in the Brotherhood closes over as if he had never been there. But the private truth of who he was, the memory of the father behind the outlaw, the story of the man as his own children knew him, that belongs to the children alone. It is the one piece of him the Brotherhood cannot reclaim. And what the children do with it, whether they let the weight of his name crush them, or carry them deeper into the same darkness that consumed him, or finally set it down and walk away toward something new, is the one thing this world cannot decide for them. Most of them, tragically, were never really given the chance to make that choice freely. Francis Boucher was pulled into his father's world too young to know better, handed a criminal identity before he could choose his own. So many of these children were shaped by their father's worlds before they were old enough to imagine any alternative, absorbed into the danger and the crime as naturally as they learned to walk. But the rare and extraordinary stories of the children who escaped, who looked at a dark inheritance and rejected it completely, who changed their names and built new lives and even turned back to atone for their father's sins, prove that the choice exists, even if almost no one manages to make it. A boss's child inherits the weight of who their father was. What they do with that weight is the one true inheritance, the only thing in this entire story that is genuinely theirs. There is a final, uncomfortable truth buried in all of this, and it is worth naming plainly before we finish. The reason these children matter, the reason their fate is not just a sad footnote to the story of their fathers, is that they are how this world perpetuates itself. Every organization, criminal or otherwise, survives by drawing in new people, and one of the oldest and most reliable sources of new members is the next generation. A boy who grows up idolizing a father in a leather cut-down, who is surrounded from birth by the club and its members and its values, who is taught that the Brotherhood is family and loyalty is everything and the outside world is the enemy, is a boy being prepared, whether anyone intends it or not, to walk the same road. This is how the cycle continues. Francis Boucher did not appear out of nowhere. He was shaped by his father's world from childhood until stepping into it felt not like a choice but like destiny. George Christie III grew up the son of a chapter president, in a home where the Hell's Angels were simply the water he swam in, and he followed his father into the club as naturally as a boy might follow his father into any family trade. The world reproduces itself through its children, and that is precisely why the children so often inherit its dangers rather than escaping them. And this is what makes the ones who broke the cycle so significant. When Sebastián Mariquin refused to become Pablo Escobar II, he was not just saving himself. He was ending a line. He was ensuring that his father's violent legacy would stop with him, that it would not be handed down to another generation, that his own children would grow up free of it. That is the real weight of the choice these rare children make. They are not just choosing their own path. They are deciding whether the darkness continues or ends. When a son follows his father into the Brotherhood, the cycle turns again, and the world claims another generation. When a child breaks away, the cycle is broken, and something that might have gone on forever finally stops. This is why the story of the children is, in a sense, the most important story of all. because the future of these violent worlds does not depend only on the men at the top. It depends on what their children choose to do with the inheritance they are handed. For most of them, tragically, the cycle simply turned. Most of the sons who were pulled toward this world were pulled all the way in, and they paid the price that this world always extracts. Most of the daughters were shut out and left to occupy the narrow spaces their mothers had occupied before them. Most of the children never got the chance, or never found the will, to imagine a life outside the only world they had ever known. That is the ordinary, sorrowful reality of what happened to the children of Hell's Angels' bosses. Not escape, but continuation. Not a breaking of the cycle, but another turn of it. And when we remember that a prosecutor once looked at one of the most powerful bikers in history and said that the most heartless thing he ever did was to pull his own son into this world, we understand the full weight of that word, continuation. Because for a child, continuation is not a neutral thing. It is a father handing down danger instead of safety, a criminal record instead of an inheritance, an early grave instead of a long life. It is the most heartless gift a parent can give, and in this world it was given again and again. The legend of the Hell's Angels is a story the men at the top tell about themselves, a story of brotherhood and power and colors defended unto death, of freedom and loyalty and the open road. But standing in the shadow of that legend, rarely mentioned and rare children, the sons who followed their fathers into the life and were consumed by it, in a prison cell or an early grave. The daughters shut out by the same rule that shut out their mothers, denied any place in the world they were born into. The innocents caught in the crossfire of wars they never chose, some of whom did not survive to grow up at all. And the rare, courageous few who found a way to run, to reject the name, to build a self that was their own. What happened to the children of Hell's Angels' bosses is not a story of inheritance and dynasty, not a story of princes taking their fathers' thrones. It is a story of a legacy that was never a gift, a name that was so often a curse, and a world that gave its children everything to fear and almost nothing to hold. The kingdom was never theirs to inherit. Only the name, the danger, and the long shadow of the men who made it. And for a very few, the courage to finally step out of that shadow and into a life of their own. That is the whole story of the children the bikers left behind. Not princes, not heirs, not the inheritors of a kingdom, but the sons and daughters of dangerous men, born into a world that promised them nothing and threatened them with everything. Each of them left in the end to answer the same hard question in their own way. What do you do with a name you never chose, in a world you were never asked to be born into? If this story showed you a side of the Hell's Angels you had never seen before, click on one of the videos showing on your screen right now, and we will take you deeper into this hidden world. We will see you in the next one.